Hey folks, John Peterson here, and today I want to talk a little bit about mid-tone contrast and why you need this in your photograph. Before I start talking about mid-tone contrast, I want to just talk to you a little bit about image processing. You know, the thing that makes us unique as photographers is A, the way we see the world, and B, the way we develop our images. There is no right or wrong way to develop our photographs in the digital darkroom. It really depends on you and what you like, what your subject is, what story you want to tell, all of that kind of good stuff. That's what makes you unique as a photographer. So there is no right or wrong way to process your images. Now, because you're on YouTube and watching this, right, obviously there's a lot of how to do something. There's very little why to do something. And today I want to talk just a little bit about why we might want to add mid-tone contrast into our images. You know, there's very few absolutes when it comes to processing images, especially for me, but there are two techniques that I use on virtually every image that I process. And the first one is vignetting. I add a vignette to pretty much 100% of the photographs that I publish. The second thing that's almost an absolute for me is adding a little bit of mid-tone contrast into the image. Now, why do I do this? Well, mid-tone contrast helps to bring definition into the midtones of a photograph. And what that does is it helps bring some depth and dimension to your photograph. It also helps you target and potentially raise color, saturation, and vibrance in the midtones only. Sometimes when we start messing with color in the shadows and the highlights, things get really kind of messed up. So by targeting just the midtones, we can add a lot of visual interest into the meat of the image. So a lot of our images are predominantly midtones, lower midtones, upper midtones. Very little bits of our images are pure shadows or pure darks or pure lights. And so midtone really covers a broad swath of our images. So depth and dimension, color, saturation, visual interest. And the third one is a little bit of mid-tone contrast also helps with perceptual sharpness. By increasing the contrast of the pixels, what you do is you get a little bit better definition between the edges of the pixels. And that helps with the perceptual sharpness in an image. So the image looks sharper overall. And then the last thing that mid-tone contrast does or can do for you is it helps to add kind of a little bit of a dehaze function to it. Anytime you add an S-curve or some contrast is really an S-curve for those that are used to working with curves. And anytime you do that, it helps to cut some of the atmospheric haze. So if I have an image that is a little bit hazy, adding a little bit of contrast can help cut through some of that haze. Now, you know, we have a global slider in Lightroom that is called contrast. And, you know, it's a great slider, but it affects every tone of the image. And this can really get messy for you if you're not careful. And so that's why I'm really wanting folks to look at selective contrast in your images. Don't touch the highlights, don't touch the shadows, but add some contrast into the midtones, and it's going to help your image really pop and jump, which is what we want typically as a photographer. You know, we're shooting a three-dimensional subject on a two-dimensional medium, and anything I can do to bring back depth and dimension is something that I want to do for my photographs. So let's jump in, take a look at this, and I'll show you a couple of little tips and tricks that might help for you to add mid-tone contrast to your images. Here's the first image I want to take a look at and demonstrate this technique to you. This shot is of Monument Valley taken from up on Hunts Mesa, late afternoon, evening, kind of approaching sunset. And you see that I've got some really good highlights in this photograph, as well as some deep shadows that are starting to develop. If you look at my histogram, I've got a lot of information kind of in the shadow area and a lot of information in the lights area. I've got a little bit of definition left in the sky, although it's a little bright and a little bit blown out. So this image is sort of flat right now. This is unprocessed. I haven't done anything to this image yet. And if I would take just my contrast slider, remember that these are all global adjustments, so it's going to affect every tonality as I move the slider. So as I move this, you see how the shadows are pushing to the left and the highlights are pushing to the right. If you watch the histogram, you see how everything's pushing out. So my shadows are getting deeper and my lights are getting lighter. And what I have is a really messy image. My darks got way blocked up, and I've lost some shadow detail in some of these darks. In my highlights, I've pretty much lost all the highlights or all the detail in the sky. So using a global contrast adjustment doesn't really do what I want it to do. I want to protect the shadows and protect the highlights, so I can preserve detail in those areas. So here's how you can add some mid-tone contrast to the image. So that way you're adding some contrast just to the mid-tone values and you're protecting the shadows and the highlights. So if we go up to our Lightroom masking tool, go to range and select luminance range. Now what you need to do is click on an area that looks like a midtone. So I'm going to just pick this right here, and my overlay shows you what's selected within that luminance range by the system. And notice over here in the mask panel, I've got this wonderful little slider that's an adjustment. And this is a two-part slider. Number one, this inner part can affect how wide or how narrow your selection is, and you can move this to different parts of the tonal range. If I want it to target kind of the lower midtones, the middle midtones, or the upper midtones, I can move this box back and forth. These two little handles here are really the feathers that you can fine-tune the mask on. So how much do you want this to bleed into a wider tonal range? And for this example, I want to keep this fairly narrow just because I really want to preserve my shadows and my highlights. And I kind of want this box positioned right in the middle. So you can see from my overlay, there's nothing in the sky that's selected, and my deeper, darker shadows are all protected as well. So now I can safely add contrast into this image and potentially some saturation if I want. And let's look at the before and the after. And what I get is a little bit deeper range of tones in my midtone value. My midtones have spread out a little bit more, so I have deeper lower mids and brighter upper mids, and that in essence is what contrast is. And what I see in this image is that it pops and jumps a little bit more. It cut some of the haze through the midground here, which was great, as well as just a little bit in the background. But I've got this with enough visual interest where I am happy to start progressing further into editing this photograph. And as a brief side note, one of the first things that I do for every photograph is I work on the light. So I work on exposure, a little bit of contrast, tonal ranges, all that type of stuff before I ever start touching color or any targeted tonal adjustments throughout the image. So doing basic exposure and contrast adjustments are some of the first things that I do in an image to get my foundation set so I can make better, more nuanced, subtler edits throughout the rest of the image. Let's take a look at another image. This particular one is from the Newport Harbor, Newport, Oregon. And I like this shot, but notice that I've got some really bright highlights happening in the sky. And the lower parts of these hulls are painted black. And I've got detail in them now, and I don't want to lose that. But the image still feels a little flat. So I want to add some depth and dimension back into it, and one of the best ways to do that is with contrast. So again, like if I take the contrast slider and just do a global adjustment to it, the blacks start to lose all the detail in them. And the lights, I'm hitting the edge, just about clipping the highlights up here in the sky, which I don't want to do. So a global contrast adjustment, even just a smidge, is still too much for me. So I would like to add some mid-tone contrast into this photograph. So the best way to do that is, again, go up to Create New Mask, go to Luminance Range, and I want to pick something that looks like a midtone, which will be right there. And you can see with the pink overlay what is adjusted. So if I use my feather, I'll bring that in a little bit. I don't really want the mountains back here. I'm really watching the mountains as I move this brighter side of things. So on the upper tonal ranges or tonal values, I'm moving the slider on the right and really sort of protecting some of the highlights that are here and up towards the tip of the mountain and the sky. And then likewise, this left-hand slider affects the darker tones in the image, and how far do I want this contrast adjustment to bleed into the darks will dictate where I put this drag handle right here. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of mid-tone contrast to this. Even if I crank it up to 100, I still have preserved all the detail in the shadows that I wanted, and I'm not blowing out the highlights up in the sky. So again, mid-tone adjustments works really well. Lastly, let's look at this shot. This is the Eastern Sierra from this year. I took a group, this was the last morning we were out there. Let's go ahead and look at, again, I did a little bit of editing to this, but let's look at the global contrast, and you can see how the shadows block up here, and I'm starting to get extremely bright and getting close to clipping over here on the left-hand side. So I want to protect my shadows in my highlights. So let's do this range, luminance range, and it looks like some values up here will be a great mid-tone value. So it selected most of the mountains, and what I want to do, of course, is protect the highlights and the shadows, but I also want to bring out some detail and nuance and depth in the rocks of this mountain. So I want to make sure that the mountains are selected. And if I just bring this up just a little bit, I start protecting my shadows. And you can see as I bring the lighter side of this feathering handle in, some of the mountain becomes deselected. So that's not what I want. I want most of the mountain selected. Let's go ahead and live with that and start adding some contrast to it. You can see how it gains definition, gets a little bit darker. I would add maybe some whites back into this. But I've got a much richer feel for the mountain, and I've protected my shadows and my highlights in this image. And for those that use Photoshop, I wanted to show you a quick example of what I do. I tend to do most of this mid-tone contrast adjustment in Photoshop. The reason being is that I've got this great set of plugins from Tony Kuiper, the TK plugins, and it makes it really easy to select the midtones. So I can go in and do a midtone selection, make my adjustments, and save that as a layer. And I wanted to just show you a quick example of that. So using the TK panel, I can come up here and do a tonality mask. And down here, I can select midtones 1, midtone 2, midtone 3. And as you see this, and for those that are not used to Photoshop, white reveals and black conceals with these layer masks. And so everything that's white will be adjusted and everything that's darker will have less adjustment on it. So I can cycle through these different tonality masks targeting the midtones and pick the one that I like that is going to select enough of the landscape to have this contrast effect take place. Now I can go in and refine and target the selections as much as I want, but you can see the sky is largely unaffected and some of the deeper shadows down here are largely unaffected. And it's this area right in the middle that's going to have the most effect along with these buttes in the background. So I just want to add a quick little S-curve to this. I'll put a point there and I'll raise my highlights just a little bit and bring my shadows down. Working with the curves tool for me gives me a little bit of a finer adjustment than using sliders in Lightroom. And that's why I like looking at this in Photoshop instead of Lightroom. So if I toggle this on and off, just watch this center section right in here. This is really what I'm watching because the light is so beautiful here. I wanted this part of the image to shine in the finished edit. So if I toggle off, on, off, on, you see how it's more dramatic, more dynamic, a little bit more saturated, and I did not add any color or saturation to this. It's really just the contrast that is making this area of the image pop. So you can see how midtone contrast can be a fantastic tool for you. Well, I hope that helps you understand a little bit about midtone contrast and why to add midtone contrast to your photographs. You know, again, we're trying to bring back depth and dimension into our photographs. Contrast helps to do that. But targeting and preserving the shadows and the highlights is why I want to use midtone contrast. Increase detail, depth and dimension, focus, make your images pop and jump off the screen. That's really kind of some of the goals for us as photographers. We want people to look at our photographs. We want to look at our photographs and enjoy them for years to come. And contrast, believe it or not, is a really easy tool to get people's attention. But it's also very easy to overdo it. So I caution you to not overdo contrast in your photographs. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, feel free to subscribe down below. Thanks for watching. Keep shooting, and I will see you guys soon. All right, bye-bye.